Panel 3, the Global Arctic and Pacific Northwest. Igor Krupnik, cultural anthropologist and curator of Arctic and Northern Ethnology Collections, National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution, will speak on the Bering Sea meeting/marketplace, making hybrid arts and trading it. Bert Poshaw, Mads Olvlesen, fellow in art history, University of Copenhagen, will speak about the walrus and the palm tree, Arctic artists and Pacific worlds. Stephen Loring, archaeologist and Arctic Studies Center at the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institutions, from talisman to trinket, ivory art and industry in the Bering Straits. And Emily Jean Leichner. Emily Jean, where are you? There's Emily Jean. Emily Jean Leichner, PhD candidate, Department of Anthropology, University of British Columbia. For future generations, Indigenous collections in museums and community-based heritage research. Let us give a warm welcome to Igor Krupnik.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, my slides are here. And where is the, just a second. People were doing it so that the white paper is seen, so. Okay, we'll figure it out. Welcome to the North. You'll see a slew of speakers, of new speakers, but you'll also see a slew of new objects, very different ones, some very different animals, and also some very different people. So this is my first slide, so try. Yeah, okay. I'll start with disclaimers. This is not a paper in art history. I'm not an art historian. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I worked in the Northern Bering Sea for my entire professional career. This is my first paper in whatever may be close to art history. I've never done anything on Scrimshaw, so please be generous. I put on slide a lot of books that have been published, only a small fraction, and I brought 2 of these for the library of this museum. You don't have it here, so you consult one if, and also I hope my colleague speaking later will tell the full story. So it's actually not the Bering Sea. Yeah, not the Bering Sea, but mostly Northern Bering Sea, that very kind of converging arc of Siberia and Alaska. And I put 3 slides here. One is the leftmost is the map of people, of indigenous people of this area. You can see like this is really a combination of so many people and different traditions. The middle one is the map of walrus migrations. We are kind of leaving the teeth, the sperm whales. We are talking now about walruses. Although the sperm whales are known to indigenous people of the area, they have the words about for the sperm whale in the native languages. Neither Stephen nor I ever heard of them doing anything with sperm whale teeth. That's completely off indigenous cultures in this area. But they have, and historically had, access to abundance, unlimited abundance of walrus ivory, because this is the way where walrus migrated back and forth from the Arctic to the North Pacific. The rightmost map shows the places where walrus go on land, the hollowed sites, where people could kill walrus easily, where walruses die, and then the carcasses are left, and the tusks can be retrieved. And lastly, oops, no. Whoops. That's a technology that I never expected. Next one. Okay, no, not this one, and not this one. Scrimshaw, yeah, sorry. This is what happens when you kind of take control from the speaker. So we don't use the word Scrimshaw for ethnographic objects. I'm sorry. We call it ivories, carved ivories, engraved objects, indigenous ivories. So for the purpose of my talk, everything which is called Scrimshaw is only whalers' products. And everything that is done by indigenous people is called ivories. Walrus ivories or carved ivories, decorated ivories, whatever. And as you can see, there is a variety of objects that we called ivories, all of them made from walrus tusk, but no Scrimshaw here. Oops. I'm supposed to do this. Yes. So I deliberately asked the question of how old is this Scrimshaw carving? It's like, as we learned, 300 years, maybe 400 years, 500 years at most, if we use the starting point with the Basque whalers up in the North Atlantic. The ivory carvings have at least 2,000 years of history, 2,500 years of history. We don't know how many hundreds of years of history, and it is very well documented on both sides of the Bering Sea. What is also very interesting, and here are some examples of what native people did with out of walrus ivory, is that they had two very different traditions. One was to do what I call 2D, two-dimensional engraved objects that were using the flat or curvilineal surface of the ivory for decoration, but they also had like a three-dimensional sculptural tradition, and all of those traditions with myriad forms in between, ornamented three-dimensional objects, all combinations of engraved images that combine different forms. This is a very old, very deeply established tradition that archaeologically can be traced, detailed, developed in styles, and used as a chronology for this part of the world. I pulled out some of the earliest objects from museum collections. And by the way, most of my illustrations are either from the Smithsonian, from our collection, or from other places where could I acknowledge where they are from. But this is like, because it's not an art history paper, I'm sorry if I missed some identification. So you could see one is the Captain Cook's supposed collection from Chukotka in 1778, one of the earliest engraved objects. Beaches, Captain Beach's objects. So what I wrote it here, these are very highly symbolic in imagery, very laconic in style, and medium to low image density. These are kind of pre-whalers era tradition of indigenous ornamented carving. Remember, symbolic, laconic, and medium to low image density. And, oops, can we go back one slide, please? And in that very universe, the whalers kind of arrived. As I call it here, guns, germs, steels, and arts, because they brought their own art into that very universe. And that art was absolutely different. Not only did it use a very different medium, a tooth or teeth of a whale that native people never used, it used, as mostly we have seen today in many slides, but also in the collections, mostly vertical type of imagery, where native imagery on tusks is always horizontal, always. And it also, as I called it here, naturalistic in imagery, very detailed, rich, high image density, mimicking European painting. People who talked about it before me, they covered it all. It's a very different cultural style. We kind of keep going back and forth. We need like 2 slides back and one more. Thank you. So what happens then, and here I'm speaking as a cultural historian, of kind of historian of cultural contact. And a friend and a colleague of mine, John Boxtas, who is in this audience, would tell it, in many more exclusive details. So I just kind of listed what happened socially and culturally in this very universe. 1850, the whalers arrived in mass into the northern Bering Sea, bringing indigenous population decline through epidemics and social disruption. They brought in drastic overkill of whale and walruses. They brought in many ships and men in native waters, in native communities or next to native communities. They were hiring native people for labor, men for crews, women for sewing, cooking, housekeeping, and all other services. And they were trading, immense trade in manufacturing goods for native products, including for tusks, decorated ivories, and what we call tourist art. So that was like 1850, not specifically 5048, but somehow it's like an explosion of cultural contact in this very place. Now we can talk about arts in contact. What happened with the arts? So the first encounter, I guess, we all could guess, was just amazing of both sides. It's like, I put it specifically, it's like 2 groups of tattooed people with knives on boats looked at each other and were just in amazement. And these were all qualified, very high-skilled whalers. They knew how to kill whales. They were, very tough people. So they looked at each other and they looked at each other's art. And naturally, first thing was borrowing. So people very quickly borrowed things from each other. And that's how certain things that I put to the right that used to be in indigenous kind of environment were immediately transformed by borrowed elements such as pipes. And we have seen already the image of pipes, but I put a couple more. And also bow drills. That was a typical indigenous object, which was very quickly transformed by this kind of influence from the whaler side. Then they were copying and trading and using carved objects as commodities. And then they were like true hybrid forms, which were never used in indigenous context. Cribbage boards, boxes, paper knives, napkin rings, bracelets, you call it. And then in that very soup of contacts, newly built forms, combination hybrid art, there was a very powerful market selection of commercially appealing forms. So what people traded for. And there was a paper which I will be citing later by Albert Heinrich, who lived on Little Diamond in the 1940s. And he described, the iron pressure of the market on different variations of carving, indigenous carving styles. It was like early 1900s, but I'm sure that in the 1850s and 1860s, whalers traded with native people what they could bring back and either sell or give as gifts. So there was a very strong pressure of what they traded for what. So here is a picture from your museum. This is just the second floor. And these are examples of what I call the hybrid art in the Bering Sea. You can see the things produced by indigenous carvers under very heavy influence of whalers, Scrimshaw style, which is the abundance of details, the ornamental elements that never used in traditional indigenous decoration style, a very realistic to the bottom left, some very realistic objects, mostly mimicking what whalers did on on the teeth, which again was never used by indigenous people, and they have very highly symbolic art. And then there was, like, I'm trying to go chronologically. So the whalers arrived, all this kind of explosion of contact, explosion of hybrid forms. And then at some point, someone had to step in and to start separating these objects one from the other. And here I have a special point for collectors from museums, early collectors from the 1870s, and certainly from the 1880s, who stepped into this area and they started very specifically select certain objects for museum. They were looking for authentic indigenous styles. They were not looking for hybrid arts. These are objects from the earliest large collection, let's call it that way. Vega expedition, 1878-79, 600 objects at the Etnografiska Museum in Stockholm. And you can see what the expedition members selected. They selected for, as examples of ethnographic authentic art, they created something that looked very native to them. And if we do the same for the Alaskan side, where there was like a whole constellation of very famous Smithsonian collectors working in Alaska from the 1860s, William Dahl, and then Lucien Turner and Edward Nelson in the 1870s. They were also collecting authentic objects. So they acted as definers of what is the museum quality objects, although some of the kind of pieces to the right, from my perspective, already illustrate the impact of Native people being familiarized with the overloaded imagery of the whalers' Scrimshaw products. So these are, although looking as authentic native style, from my perspective, already demonstrate the impact of people's familiarity with, again, what collectors will take as authentic objects from indigenous people. Too many details, too many figures, too much stories on the tusk compared to indigenous type. And then, to make things even more complicated, the gold rush, the city of Nome emerging on the shores of the northern Bering Sea. Now a shadow of itself, the city of Nome, very well familiar to me personally, used to be like the 20,000-30,000, the largest American or white people populated place to the north of Vancouver. And of course, it became like a huge magnet for indigenous people. It became like a magnet for traders. It became like a magnet for everyone. And here we see indigenous people living in Nome engaged in seasonal commercial production of ivory. This is it, seasonal commercial production of ivories. From June and until October, dozens of families, and certainly dozens of men, lived on the beaches of Nome doing nothing but carving for tourists, for commercial industry, for souvenirs. So what happened then with this, from my perspective, that actually marginalized the Scrimshaw products of production by whalers in favor of so-called indigenous ivory carving. So this entire interaction that started with a very powerful intrusion of whalers' art ended up, surprisingly, with the victory of the native tradition, although deeply transformed and influenced by the elements of whalers carving. And here I'm using the example of the famous Danish explorer Knud Rasmussen, who ended up in Nome in the fall of 1924. And from Nome, he went to Chukotka, to the side of Siberia, and brought back 5 carved ivory tusks, walrus tusks. That story is covered in detail by my colleague and friend Michael Bronstein, an art curator in Moscow. And he kind of described all 5 tusks that that Rasmussen brought back. And you can see that they have very details of originally and the art style of the original Scrimshaw carving. They have ornamental motifs that were never in indigenous art tradition, like flowers. And they have this kind of overgrowth, overdensity of object story that definitely was the byproduct of their familiarity with the, I believe, with the Scrimshaw system. And then the last point in this long story was the arrival of professional artists. That happened on the Russian side early in the 1930s with the organization of the professional carving art shop or art studio in one of the native communities called Uelen. They brought professional artists to impose some artistic guidance to kind of uneducated indigenous carvers. This is all covered in that very interesting paper written by my late colleague Tamara Mitlyanskaya, how Russian art directors actually changed indigenous art style. And you can see that many elements, particularly for the tusk at the low right, bottom right, is very much like the Scrimshaw style. So, to conclude, supposed to work, yeah. So, Northern Bering Sea was a historical meeting place, a crossroads for people, cultures, and art tradition. That is very clear to us. Oh, it's kind of, from the earliest known samples, the area had at least 2 different indigenous styles, which I called engraved imagery and 3-dimensional sculpture with myriad forms in between. Yankee whalers Scrimshaw tradition arrived around 1850, bringing new styles, materials, and impacts, including influence from Portugal, Azores, Hawaii, and Southern Pacific. So it's not only Yankee Scrimshaw tradition, art tradition, but it's like the whole gamut of the entire world of commercial whaling that they brought with them. The new encounter generated intensive cultural exchange and trade and artistic styles and materials. Interaction among different artistic traditions evolved under the pressure of market, I cannot see what is written here, and consumers' preferences. The critical role of ethnographic museums and collectors should be acknowledged. Sorry. City of Nome pushed many native men to become semi-professional carvers, but at that time, whalers' Scrimshaw products were pushed to the margins of the curious market. They were not being sold in Nome. And lastly, market demand was a key driver in object and style transitions on the Alaskan side, and in Chukotka, native carving developed under heavy pressure from state-sponsored guidance by professional artists. And my last slide is from the streets of the city of Nome, showing all the directions you can go. Thank you.
Hello. I first wanted to say alukut tamasi bartimik katakaf pongam ekumit like sariani kinis masli pongam. That is Kalaallisut, which is one of the easternmost Inuit languages in Kalaallit or Greenland, as we often call it in English, is where my strongest relationships are, and they're not in Alaska, which is what I'll be talking about. But I also just wanted to, I think also building on things that Courtney was talking about this morning, also give space for Inuit languages to also like resound and take up space on the continent. But I also wanted to say kuyanak and thank you to Naomi and Sienna for their invitation, all their tireless work in getting this started. Oh, and also, of course, a huge thank you to Ivy Oberlin, without whom the very structure of this presentation would not be possible. So I'm also very thankful to Igor for that really perfect introduction, because I am an art historian, which is what I said in Kalaallisut. And it is kind of the advantage point I'll be talking about it. So I've titled this the Walrus and the Palm Tree, I think for reasons I hope will become clear. So, oh wait, here we go. Amazing. Okay, so this label is incorrect. It's by Ango Kwajuk and not by Billy Kumanasiok. But anyways, so as we just heard, of course, we know that the city of Nome, or Signasuak, had sort of mushroomed overnight around 1898, 1899, as around some 30,000 people in 2 years flushed to bury out flecks of gold eroding from the soil. Of course, for Inupiat who lived there, this dramatically changed their proximity to settler culture. And of course, as we've just heard, Inupiat Nupik and their ancestors had long engaged in cosmopolitan trading networks, but the social realities, especially of the gold rush, created new colonial conditions that had transformed Indigenous life. So this tusk I show you, which is from a local collection, is really the epitome, I think, of what we understand about what a cribbage board is. This is really the most distinctive, I think, visual form that we think of happening in the late 19th century, which is the Kattuik, or the ivory cribbage board. These are pretty obviously immediately discernible objects, right? They're curved, cream-colored walrus tusks, often bear some 70 or more holes bored into the side of them. And an artist also incises pictorial, normally naturalistic motifs into the tusk and colors the grooves with dark pigment or black ink. It also became the cribbage board, the most dominant expressive media of Inupiaq, and to a lesser extent, Yupik artists, catering to this new demand that happens with the gold rush for souvenirs. But the sudden abundance of the cribbage boards at the turn of the 20th century also revealed their incredible popularity, and also informed how, as we just heard, Indigenous artists respond to this market demand. It's easy to see why they're so attractive to non-native consumers. The unusual medium of the walrus tusk is already a literal material embodiment of Arctic geographies, and of course exoticized upon its transformation as a souvenir object. But also incised onto the tusk itself, imagery often reflected artists' deep repertoire of the activities of the region's distinctive animals. Often we see brawls between, here we see a person and a polar bear, or a polar bear and a walrus, or curious seals, or in this instance, reindeer, or even just a single fish. And in other examples that we also have at this museum, there's a lot of examples of Indigenous mapping and other kinds of visual languages. But I think there's also, in an art historical perspective, an interesting phenomenon that cribbage boards are also really multimedia artworks of Indigenous and especially Inupiaq and Yupik modernity. And Ango Kwajuk, who is undoubtedly probably the most well-known Inupiaq artist at the turn of the 20th century, also routinely sourced photographs, also photographs he sat for of himself with his wife, to also create hyper-realistic imagery. So the image that we just saw in Igor's presentation of the sled dogs howling is also by Angkor Kwajalein is also sourced from a photograph in a postcard photograph in the same way. So I also show you this on the right is a self-portrait by Charles Madeluc. And what I really like about this is that there's a way in which photographs help mediate the visual appearance and portraiture as it's carved onto walrus tusks, but also for other Nupiat and some of the earliest indigenous photographers that lived there, they also take that process of making meaning from incision and use that to incise onto the negative of the photograph as it's being produced. So there's also, I think, a really beautiful, I think, correspondence between the importance and of self-portraiture and what that does, I think, for indigenous artists at this time. But as they also, because they boomed in popularity, cribbage boards, especially carved and incised by Nupik and Nupik artists, became soon understood as too modern for the ways in which white US actors wanted to display Alaska, especially to an unknowing continental public. For instance, when J. Stanley opened an exhibition of Alaska material culture in Seattle 3 years before what you see on the screen in 1906, he had boasted that, quote, every part of Alaska has been represented, and no modern curios are allowed in the collection. Stanley's collection had later also played a key role in the dissemination of Native Alaska material culture into the lower 48, not least into the Smithsonian's own collection of objects. But as Kate Duncan has shown, Stanley also specifically noted that he had, quote, and in this display, carefully avoided cribbage boards and other modern shop curios. But when Seattle held the Alaska Yukon Pacific of 1909, Stanley had won a gold medal for this very cacophonous, intense, over-the-top, and macabre display, a little bit of ivory carving, where he said there was not a single cribbage board. But of course, upon close inspection, as I've already highlighted in yellow, we can identify, of course, even this statement was not truthful. In the center of this macabre abundance of tusks is also a handheld piece of ivory carved into the shape of a caribou. Actually, I think it's a reindeer, which is an important distinction I'll get to later. Which is also now on display at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. This distinct sculpture, of course, is clearly a cribbage board, yet its display in 1909 is also a deliberate attempt to conceal the peg holes from the viewer. So what I mean by that is that when you see it from this sort of above angle, it's very obvious it has the sort of game board elements of a cribbage board. When you see it in the vitrine case, right, it's displayed in a way that viewers seeing it wouldn't see the game board pieces. And of course, it is really simply just the existence or the absence of these peg holes that determines whether or not an ivory tusk actually is a board game. And supposedly this modern object that white anthropologists refused to buy, as we've just heard, because they challenged ideas of authenticity. Ivory cribbage boards had also materialized in an Arctic indigenous modernity that was keenly perceptible to outside audiences at the turn of the 20th century, but also undesirable to those who wish to construct academic ethnographic narratives based on Alaska Native material culture. Of course, this is because Inupiaq modernity challenged the racialized logics of environmental determinism, a theory of white supremacy that held immense influence in the 19th century. Environmental determinism had upheld racial hierarchies as the result of geography, the extreme effects of which could be seen in two locations, in tropical spaces at the equator, and of course, at frozen icy geographies of the Arctic. White scientific thought had claimed that tropical abundance created lazy, indolent people, whereas colonial perceptions understood the ice itself was somehow a barrier to civilization. As the Arctic geographer Jen Rose Smith has argued, ice is, of course, a historically racialized geography that in the white colonial imagination had produced so-called inferior beings because ice was incompatible with European and Euro-American presumptions about civilization. And she notes that ice does not produce agriculture, it does not give root, it does not generate arborescence, it is not rhizomatic. So ice also becomes, outsiders assume, a geography of isolation. It is disconnected from the rest of the world, supposedly, and also an extreme environment at the ends of the earth. So as outsiders repeatedly construed the Arctic as a land of scarcity, and I'm also very appreciative of Igor's emphasis on understanding the abundance that has always been there. The pictorial evidence of incised walrus tusk, as we've seen, became vital clues to understanding indigenous life to sustain US goals of colonization, ongoing occupation, and assimilation. But if pictorial engraving functions as evidence, how do we understand the incorporation of imagery that is decidedly not of the Arctic? For instance, the Field Museum, which has come up many times today, houses a spoon carved out of a walrus tusk. Of course, this is not a customary form. But at the bowl of the spoon, we see 3 hunters who stand on top of their umiak and raise spears or harpoons in advance of 5 walruses, tusks at the ready, who charge directly towards them. Behind the walruses, we see another boat that has chased the animals into the proximity of the other hunters. And I think this circular curvature of the spoon also heightens this drama, suggesting an imminent impact, right? The walruses are just about, they're either going to be speared or they're going to crash into the boat. But the handle also visualizes other kinds of relations, framed between 2 pine trees, already an unusual motif in the treeless Arctic tundra. It's a bear and a caribou who walk towards one another. Perhaps the pine helps the caribou evade the vision of the hunter on the right, who stands ready to release an arrow from his bow. But most puzzlingly is the last motif on this spoon, a palm tree. Unlike the pine trees, whose pointy coniferous needles face the sky, the palm tree's draping fronds suggest instead a warm, even tropical locale. So maybe we are going back to the warmth from the cold mid. What I find so exciting about this detail of the palm tree incised onto walrus ivory is the ambivalence it introduces to the presumptions that some of us might have about what the arts of the global Arctic, and especially pictorial ivories, not Scrimshaw, might present to us. Indeed, of course, the palm tree suggests a geography worlds away from Inupiaq and Yupik homelands. And on the opposite side of the spoon, it appears as though hunters have pulled a whale to shore. But the palm tree raises the critical question. Maybe this image of whalers is not about Arctic denizens whatsoever. Could this whaling scene take place somewhere else in the Pacific? And if so, could this unusual spoon record an archive? Also thinking about what Maggie was saying earlier, by an Inupiaq or Yupik artist about their own participation and experience of the vast cosmopolitan worlds of Pacific whaling beyond the ice. Now, of course, the spoiler alert is that this is probably not even by an Inupiaq or Yupik artist, and research by Amy Phillips Chan also suggests it might be Sukpiaq, but that's who was a man who was convicted of murder charges and got out of it through anthropological illustrations. But that's a different rabbit hole. So what remains today, I want to also take maybe cue from this kind of ambiguous or unclear meaning of this juxtaposition of the walrus and the palm tree, also as an opportunity to maybe zoom out from the usual context that we understand global Arctic arts at the turn of the 20th century, which is to say, to maybe zoom out a little bit from the immediate focus of cultural context zones between we presume to be the Inupiaq or Yupik indigenous artist and then the outsider settler tourist consumer. So I want to go back not just in geography, but also a little bit in space to Mexico. We might look further south, along the Pacific coast of Mexico, where a Spanish artist had carved an image of Saint Dominic with a dog. He was basing his image on European print imagery. But as you can see, particular visual language, especially the dog on the bottom right, ties in East Asian iconography of what dogs looked like. But instead of carved in elephant ivory, which is the most common way that ivory had circulated along Pacific coastlines in the Spanish Empire from the Philippines often to Mexico, instead it is actually carved in walrus ivory. So this walrus ivory carving is meant to emulate how Chinese artisans, normally in the colonial Philippines, had created and used Asian and African elephant ivory to make devotional images for patrons across colonial Latin America. But what I think is so interesting about Reynoso's very small sculpture is not only that he wants to emulate this kind of trans-Pacific style of Asian sculptors making objects for a colonial Latin American market, but also that he does so using walrus ivory that had somehow gotten to Mexico from ostensibly the Arctic. Now, this coastal trajectory from the Arctic in the 17th century and how it got to Mexico, I have absolutely no idea. And I think this is also because we haven't asked these kinds of questions. And I'm also realizing that this might be the first time that Latin America has come up as a part of the Pacific Rim world at all today, which is also, I think, a question that we should ask ourselves about why, and why Latin American locations are normally sometimes absent from when we think about the circulation of ivory and the field of Scrimshaw. But I think what's interesting and exciting about it is also reveals something about the global extent of Arctic trade along Pacific worlds, right, centuries before European colonization begins in the 18th century. There are also examples of, I guess you could call Scrimshaw, that attest to Alaska Native artists who are also recording their own direct participation in the creation of Pacific worlds. So this is a incised sperm whale tooth that is in the Estonian History Museum in Tallinn. It was collected by a Baltic Germans from the area of Estonia and Latvia were very big actors in the expansion of the Russian Empire into Alaska in the 18th century. So here on one side of the tooth, we can see there are, where is the special? Yeah. So there's about like 6 pairs of hunters in this sort of unusual kayak form of two hunters per boat. You can see all of them either paddling forward with their oars. Some of them have spears or bows and arrows, and they all have very distinctive hats. When we turn the tooth, also I'm thinking about how the fact, as Marina talked about earlier, you have to constantly think about the visuality of how these objects work. You can see there are an array of animals. On the bottom, there may be whales or porpoises. The museum record in Estonia and Tallinn says that these are seals. They're not seals. They're otters. And we know they're otters because they follow a very common iconography of how you represent otters in Alaska Native art. This is an Alutuk or Sugpiaq example of Pacific sea otters being recumbent on their backs, floating on the top of the water, and always in this very Edvard Munch, the Scream kind of style, with the sort of its hands up to its face. So this is how we know they're otters. And then when we follow the tusk on the other side, we see there's actually more hunters seemingly engaged in the same kind of act. But I think what's really the most interesting about this example is that when you turn it around again, actually the abundance that we didn't realize was abundance on one side suddenly dwindles. And where there were maybe 6 or 7 sea otters, now in this example, there's only 1 sea otter and just 2 whales or other animals, and then another, this is maybe a seal. Now what I think is, oops, not yet. So what I think is really interesting about this is that we know this is actually, it's sort of from its iconography, especially of the 2-figure hunters in the kayaks and of their hats in particular. This is a very specific moment in the history of Alaska. And then we're talking about, in this part, the Aleutian Islands and like Prince William Sound. So we're thinking Southern Pacific Alaska and not necessarily Arctic Alaska. And the reason why I think this tooth is really important is because it records this harvesting of sea otters and how they go from abundance and dwindle. And the reason that is happening is because the main impetus for the Russian Empire expanding into the Americas and occupying Onondaga and Sugpiaq homelands is to capture and sell sea otters and trade sea otter pelts to Qing, China. And as you can see, this is an ancestor portrait on the right that is in the Smithsonian Museum of Asian Art. Sea otter pelts were turned into duanjiao, which are outer coats, because fur had a new kind of importance in the beginning of Qing Manchu rule that filtered from an elite symbol into a sort of everyday status symbol by the 18th century. And so Alaska Native hunters become forced and coerced to not only harvest these otters that the Russian Empire does not only exploit their knowledge, but also under really violent conditions of duress, force them to overhunt otters to the brink of extinction. So what I think is interesting about the tusk and the fact that it's sort of, it moves back and forth between these hunting practices of abundance and then dwindling, is it also, it acts as a sort of indigenous testimony, right, to the actual environmental conflicts and devastations that are occurring. But at the same time, because it still turns around, there's a way where we can also read, I think, the dwindling also back into this new abundance of population. So there's also a way I think that it also, it's a little bit predicting the future of what also is hoped to be understood in these specific worlds. So I show that example because, this idea about the sudden sort of disappearance and these dramatic population flows or Arctic crashes, one might say, of animal populations also becomes repeated in Arctic situations by the 1890s. And Sheldon Jackson, who originally is tied to the Department of Education in the US, has this commentary about the walrus already practically going extinct by 1890. He says, where a few years ago, they were so numerous that their bellowings were heard above the roar of the waves and grinding and crashing of the ice fields. This year, I cruised for weeks without seeing or hearing one. But commerce wanted ivory, destroying thousands annually for the sake of their tusks. Basiba Demuth, in her critically acclaimed environmental history of the Bering Strait, also talks about this phenomenon, and I really appreciate the way in which she concisely talks about this idea of chopping free tusks as a poor man's substitute for elephant ivory, and the ways in which the Euro-American whalers who are shooting and killing these walrus, right, this overkill that Igor was just referencing, also abandon these bodies, and they're sort of just slopping into the sea. So I bring this up because highlighting this sort of overkill of walruses, I think also maybe should inform how we think about the creation and circulation of walrus ivory pictorial imagery, like precisely at the exact same time that they're being overhunted. And I also bring in this because Sheldon Jackson had also used this sort of very hyperbolic language claiming that Alaska Natives, and especially Inupiat, were on the brink of imminent doom and starvation, which of course is always a red flag when you think about how white people are describing indigenous cultures. But he does so in order to explain why the US government needs to invest in a pretty intense scheme, which is the relocation of 500 reindeer from Scandinavian Arctic into Alaska. So he had tried earlier to bring reindeer from the Russian part of the Bering Strait with Chukchi herders, and that experiment failed for various reasons. But he did convince the US government to fund this migration of 70 indigenous Sami families with their 500 reindeer on this absurd journey. They happened 2 times, one in 94 and one in 98, where they go from Guadalajara to Kautokeino in Sapmi, and they put them on a train, 500 reindeer and a lot of lichen. And eventually they go to London, they're on a boat, they're shipped to New York, they get off at Ellis Island, the reindeer I don't think they're processed in immigration, but they're pushed onto these trains. The trains like huddle, shuttle them across to Seattle. In 1898, they can't get to Sinatsuak or Nome because America is trying to colonize the Philippines. So there are no boats that they can take from Seattle, so they have to go down to San Francisco and take a boat from San Francisco and eventually get to Alaska. I say this because Sami reindeer culture really, I mean, first of all, it's a weird assumption that Arctic indigenous knowledge is somehow fungible, that it can be sort of copy and pasted from an Arctic Scandinavian situation into a different Arctic geography and culture on the other side of the world, right? But that's the assumption that is explaining this movement of reindeer and of people, and that Sami would ostensibly share their knowledge and expertise of reindeer herding with the Inupiat. But it does actually happen. And there you see it also very clearly on the iconography of Alaska Native pictorial carvings that emerge in this hybrid art situation. And you see how they emerge and also are working side by side. And they use, for instance, these Sami sleds are known as pulkas. And you can identify this person as Sami because he has a four-pronged hat known as a chiakapir, which just means four-pronged hat in Northern Sami. And they're using reindeer, right, to pull them on this sled. And so what I think is also interesting is that suddenly this import of reindeer provides, as walruses are disappearing, another medium onto which indigenous artists can practice pictorial carving. And this is an example here from the Whaling Museum, where an Inupiaq artist has used reindeer to carve a landscape of St. Michael on one side, which is also a place where a reindeer station was established. And then on the other side, also depict the reindeer herds that are suddenly living there. So I just also include this other Inupiaq painting, and you see in both cases, the way in which reindeer are distinguished from caribou is that reindeer are domesticated. And there's especially a different kind of relationship and closeness that is necessary for an Inupiaq to learn in order this sort of inskillment that happens that changes their relationship, that instead of hunting caribou herds out on the land, that they domesticate reindeer and herd them in corral stations as they do in Scandinavia. So I just showed this is just an example from St. Michael, where the harnesses are directly actually like Sami. This is a Sami creative practice known as doji. And you see a Sami sled next to a Chukchi style sled. So even though the Chukchi experiment supposedly failed, they're still sort of, they vie for dominance and they exist at the same time. So the reason I'm also sort of showing you this is also to register the ways in which the pictorial imagery that artists are making are not only catering to what tourists want to see, but are actively documenting the environmental and social and epistemological changes that are happening in Inupiaq life. And so I just added from Tuktuk to Kunyik because Tuktuk is Inuit language word for caribou, and Kunyik is a Chukchi loan word that they use to distinguish reindeer. So there's also even Inupiaq ideas about animals and animal-related Arctic animals, begins to radically change. And also those animals, reindeer, also become a medium, for Scrimshaw. So just my last thing is that I think my point in also sort of pulling out these other kind of diverse histories is also to realize that I think there's a lot of work to be done to think about the audiences and the cultures that are impacting Native Alaska imagery. And I just show this really absurd, weird example of these two tusks that is a depiction of an enslaved person escaping enslavement, and sort of painted, we presume, around the Fugitive Slave Act. And I just bring in to dialogue this new book on Black lives in Alaska, which on the cover is an image of Black whalers at Ukivik. And also on the right, in this book, Beyond Hawaii, that's thinking about native labor in the Pacific world, is also thinking about how Kanaka or Native Hawaiians are also actively in the Arctic at the same time. And maybe that's why there's a palm tree on that spoon. So thank you very much.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting how many of these themes I'm going to touch on as well, but I'm also going to delve in quite somewhat a different direction. But I'm enjoying the discussion so far. We figure out how this works. I think efficiency with these machines is correlated with age of the button pusher. Is it this top button that we move on? This one is. Okay. Thank you. We'll try it anyway. Oh, okay. Okay, great. Great. Well, Igor and I live on the same floor of the museum, but we come from different perspectives. So I have a slightly different spin on this story this afternoon. But I want to, whoops, that's all right. I'm going to I want to make a deep dive into just a very different realm of the relationship between people, animals, the prey species, and the resulting outcome that we see in the material objects, so that we have, the industrial presence of the whaling ships in the Arctic, with their life on board, very much, anchored with the developed society from which they have emerged, and they're just bringing, it's like a space capsule. They're bringing bits of New England with them, and quite different from and distancing themselves from the indigenous communities that they encounter. And you contrast that with, oops, well, just go gently. Can we go back one? You just counter, the magnificence of the industrial presence with the large, whaling ship, with the much smaller whaling boats of the indigenous North Alaskan and Inupiat people, crafted out of driftwood and walrus skins, and the immediacy and the intimacy of their adaptation to the environment. Now, as Igor mentioned, there's 3,000 years of Arctic adaptations and peoples. We're going to spare you all that. We're just going to jump, who are using marine mammal products, to shape their lives, but also to reference the symbolic and the spiritual relationship that they have with their prey species. And this begins around, well, the story that I'm going to tell begins around 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, when native North Alaskans had perfected a whale hunting technology using these small, umiak, walrus-covered skin boats to pursue whales. And we know this from the archaeological record, where we find just a few of these early ideographic carvings, depicting scenes of whale hunting. We also know about it, from the Thule period houses that, at this time period, the whale hunters, spread from their homelands in Alaska and the Bering Straits, across the Canadian Arctic all the way to Greenland. But from an archaeological point of view, we find evidence of this, of their presence, from the remains of their very dramatic houses. And the houses themselves are composed of whale bones, so that the very animals, that their life depends on, are providing the raw material to build the houses that they're living in. And then the heat from those houses is coming from lamps boiling down the blubber. So there's an intimacy of life. I mean, just, just imagine in the winter, on the darkened confines of your small house, with two or three related families together. And you're just surrounded by evidence of that abiding relationship that you have with the prey species. And we see this, where I'm an archaeologist, we're a museum anthropologist, we're biased by our material objects. We try to infer the story that, every object has a story, try to pull that out. And, you see that in some of these, so the success of hunting whales was predicated on a set of behaviors that showed that showed your respect for the animal. There's an expression I like to use that you're not a good hunter, you're a devout hunter. It's not how clever you are at sneaking up on the animals. It's that you show respect. The animals realize that, and they give themselves to you. So that it's the spirit, and you see that, both in carvings like this, where you're seeing the kind of the midwinter celebration of people honoring the spirit of the whale. You see it in the recognition of the deities, the animal masters that controlled the coming and the going of the animals. And you see it in the material culture that is evident among the Inupiat and Yupik whale hunting peoples of the North Pacific Strait. There's some wonderful language, that Rasmussen collected when he was coming across the Arctic and talking with native peoples, and he's meeting with a Inuit informant or colleague, and the man just gets frustrated with him always asking questions. Why are you always asking questions? And he goes into a discussion about how, and it's all in relation to amulets, which is what I'm showing here, which is just, why do you have these amulets? What's going on? And he says, why? And it's because the food that human beings eat to survive is comprised entirely of the souls of the animals they hunt. And we live in fear. We fear all these things. We fear starvation, we fear death, we fear old age, we fear incapacitation. And there's ways to behave. There's ways, of which the proper ways to relate to animals, that they will give their largesse to you, that they'll share that with you. And so that when you look at this material culture, and these are amulets that would be worn on the Umialek, on the whaling captains, hidden away in his clothes, that would just speak to the relationship that he has with the animals he's hunting. And you see this in a host of non-walrus ivory artifacts. I'll get back to that. But you see this in a host of artifacts, that are part of their culture. So these are the seats. We're looking at the bottom, the underside of the seat that the Umialek, the whaling captain, would have on the back of his umiak, so that underneath his seat, there's already carved this image of the species of the prey that they're searching for. And oftentimes these whale carvings will have a little quartz crystal or blue bead, placed where the blowhold is. All again, just sort of speaking to trying to appease the animals that they're hunting. And you see it again in the front of the boat. There are these ivory holders that were crafted on which the harpoon would lay, in pursuit of the whale. And you can see, you can see this beginning of this, this symbolic language, depicting the hoped for results of the whale hunt. And you can see that some of them are shaped in the whales. And these tools are all made, in the winter, during the winter, and they're made with reverence, like, you had to think good thoughts about the prey species that you were after, or because the animals know what you're thinking. and if you don't observe this like deep respect while you're making these tools, you're just going to be out of luck, when it comes to the hunting season. And there's a wonderful expression that Barbara Bodenhorn, an anthropologist that was working in North Alaska, and she was talking to these whaling captains, these Umyaliks, and one of them told her, "I'm not a good hunter. My wife is." And what's that about? And it's reference to the fact that when you would go hunting, you would put on new clothes. You'd put on clean clothes. That the animals, the prey species that you're after would recognize that you're using their gift in a responsible, respectful fashion. And I think that's what we see when we look at these classes of tools. These are harpoon boxes, where you would keep the sharp distal end of the harpoon point, the slate blade. You don't want a lot of sharp objects wandering around the bottom of your skin boat, so you keep them safely in these boxes. And then when they break or you need a sharp one, a new one, you can attach it. But all the time that these stone blades, are not being in use, they're living inside the whale, so that when you attach it finally, to the harpoon head, it goes home, it goes back to where it came from. Now, all this imagination, all this thinking good thoughts about animals, it takes place in a wide variety of celebrations and social gatherings, feast of Thanksgiving and welcome among communities, coming together, during times of feasting and celebration. And imagine them again, in these kind of darkened, houses, semi-subterranean, underground. It's winter, it's cold outside, it's dark, and it's illuminated by whale oil, blubber, walrus oil lamps, and the music that's going on is a lot of drumming, and the drums, of course, are speaking to the spirit world as well. And what I love so much about this class of artifacts, if you look at the drum hoop frame, and you can see this really intricate piece of carving that allows the hoops to join together. But when you look at them, you can see that there are faces on them, and the faces are facing inward. They don't face outward. They face inward to the drum, as a kind of a directly speaking to the spirit world that the drum is trying to evoke. And I think that's just a interesting observation. So ivory, walrus ivory, is used to construct everyday objects. In this case, a bunch of bag handles and toggles, but always, speaking to many times speaking to the transformative relationship that animals have. Animals, transform from one to another. Animals and people. There's a whole language and a whole mythology predicated on this kind of transformative relationship between animals and people, which I think are signaled in objects of everyday use like these. And also note the presence of a blue bead on a lot of these objects. Blue beads are a really interesting symbolic shorthand, I believe, for kind of the transition between the spirit world and the human world. It's the portal. It's like the hole in the ice from which the seals emerge, or the boundary between the spirit world and the human world. And blue beads, I'll come back to it, but they figure significantly in the 19th century Inupiat art. Also, in the dance house, in the wintertime, you're making tools, you're making next year's hunting tools. There's a lot of forms that I refer to as sympathetic magic. So here's a carving of a caribou, and it's got the hole in the middle, and it's a shaft straightener. It's what you steam your wood, remember all the wood that they have is sort of driftwood from Siberia, or it's come down the Yukon, so it's kind of twisted and messed up. So you have to straighten it to make your arrows and your spear shafts, and you steam it, and then you rub it back and forth. But you use this as a kind of a wrench to kind of bend, the wood to make it straight. So all the time that you're making your tools, you're thinking good thoughts about the animals you're hoping to hunt with it. And then they, like these harpoon foreshafts of these carnivorous animals, you launch the harpoon, and it's your good thoughts and the spirits that are entailed in them that will produce the result that you hope to get. And so I think that's a feature of this, of a lot of this artwork from. And then there's this whole business of the relationship of hunters, to their quarry, and the symbolic relationship of men and walrus. And you see it in these remarkable labrettes, which are carved out of ivory, but then they had these big Chinese blue glass beads that have been split and affixed to that. And there's a wonderful account from a British sailor who was stationed at Point Barrow in 1853, I think. The British had sent a ship to Point Barrow in the hopes that Sir John Franklin, now had been lost for about 8 years, that a few of them might have struggled out and would somehow get to northern Alaska, and they would be rescued finally. But he has a wonderful journal. But he writes about a Inupiat man who left Barrow, going to a trading fair in Siberia, and he returns, 9 months later, with having traded away his sled, his dog team, $1,000 of 1850 worth of baleen for one of these glass beads, and considered himself the. So that just signals that somehow the importance of that trade. So having sort of set the stage a little bit with the iconography of the symbolism of the day-to-day tools that were being crafted out of ivory, now I want to go back to the same kind of material that Igor was introduced us to a little bit, and which represents an extraordinary corpus of stories, about Inupiat and Yupik Bering Straits people. And these are these objects that I have the same Captain Cook bow drill, which is interesting because it was collected in the 1870s, and already in 1770, there's a very evolved style, ideographic language. There's a whole language of subjects. And a recognized way of depicting various scenes, which is. So what happened between those early Thule minimalist drawings and then this whole bow drill thing is a little bit of terra incognita, because we don't know. I mean, the first ones we find are these ones that Cook et al. Was collecting, but it forms an amazing corpus of art. There's hundreds of these bow drills, and I'll share a little bit of them with you. Just with the detail, just see to me, it's extraordinary how the minimalist of lines, the same with that tooth that Bart just showed us with the Aleut sea otter hunters. Just with the minimal of line, you just capture so much reality and so much behavior. And if you know walrus behavior, and if you know these animals, you recognize how nuanced these drawings are, and these pictures. And so this one here, you see a bow drill from about 1870 with a gnome style scrimshaw from about 1900. You see the evolution of the art form. But I just want to share a little bit with you, the richness of some of the themes. And so whaling, of course, and I'm going to have to discuss with Bart his interpretation of his trees, because I don't, maybe, but it's really interesting when you see the whales, where their breathing hole a lot of these bow drills show breath, and I think that's what you're seeing from the trees. It's different from what you had, but it's something to think about. And so we have scenes of whaling. We have scenes of caribou hunting. And I love this lower image because not only does it show a lot of caribou, but it also suggests perspective. As the caribou are just so far that they get smaller in the distance. But again, I think you can just see some idea. And the upper drawing in the middle, just, if you hunted caribou, if you know of caribou, those are just such lifelike poses, of startle, sudden recognition that there's human beings around that they need to be thinking about. And then also, which I won't go into here, but just a wealth of domestic scenes, and some of them are quite hilarious, some are quite risque. They deal with celebrations, they deal with feasting. It's just a wide array, it's an extraordinary corpus of art. And I know Igor showed a recent Smithsonian publication we did with Amy Chan on a lot of the bow drills in the Smithsonian collection, which if people are interested in, I can talk more to afterwards. And then we see the arrival of the whalers, and you see them, the top image, Inupiat man, he's got his arms out in a kind of a universal gesture of welcome and, let's talk. And then the boat, and I think those are whale breaths, from the distance being seen. Of course, a paddle wheeler, probably not up in the Arctic Ocean, but coming down the Yukon. But again, at this transition of this art form going into recognizing the appearance of Europeans and their presence on the coast. And this speaks to what Bart was talking about, was with the decline of whaling, both because of the transition from baleen to other materials, but also the decline of the animals in Arctic waters. There is a extraordinary surgence of the commercial hunting, headhunting of walrus. And if you're in the Bering Straits, there may be no walrus. The walruses ride the ice front, so there can be no walrus, and then suddenly there can be just walrus everywhere. I think you get some indication of that in the kinds of slaughter that was going on, and so witness here, and with as Igor mentioned, with the gold rush, with the end of the whaling in the late 1880s, whatever, and then the emergence of the gold rush in the late 1880s, 1890s, first in the Yukon and the beaches in Nome. It's an explosion of people and possibilities. And now we go into this well-trodden material of the local carvers. And, they're just stunning, workmanship. And the scholarship hasn't really been produced yet, but the potential's there. And you see individual carvers like this person from Nunavut Island, that made these extraordinary, three-dimensional rounded carvings. And then you get noted, I think we've seen this cribbage board before, but just, the detail that of the transition of the art from the kind of storytelling, narrative, indigenous imagery of the bow drills to now this more Scrimshaw-like, and just, they're masterpieces of representation and art. And this is a piece in the Baltimore Art Museum that I just saw recently, but it is a cribbage board, but it is also an unbelievably detailed map of the Yukon River with, I can just imagine the frustrated gold miners, well, did we check out this creek or did we go up this river? But it's quite impressive. And I quickly saw up here as well that you have a number of these maps. And again, I don't think anyone's ever written a kind of nice kind of geography type paper on the use of the formation of maps. And as Bart and others have mentioned, just the emergence of these extraordinarily skilled carvers and their work. And with the gold miners, they're always washing out fossil ivory so that we have a slight market in that. Fossil ivory doesn't stay together as nicely as walrus ivory, so we don't see a lot of it. But there is this one piece that that I saw in a collection in Virginia of fossil mammoth ivory, you know, and then the whole burgeoning of the tourist art, you know, so that suddenly you just get all these things like, you know, stick pins, and just got a few more slides with craftsmanship, and then these, no, it's okay. Well, just art, letter openers, souvenirs, you know, made for you know, for sale to travelers in Nome, and then also the appearance of this object, which just the Billiken figure, which shows up around 1908, and is popular. I don't know why, but has a very visible presence. And this central object, which is at the Billiken, that's at the St. Louis Museum of Art, is the only piece I've ever seen incorporating a piece of gold from Alaska, which I've just puzzled about because, you know, the Inuit and the Inupiat they found everything. They found meteoritic iron, they found jade, they found stones, they found fossil things. They must have stumbled over gold nuggets, you know, in their traversing of the Stewart Peninsula and elsewhere. But, you know, whether they were smart enough to keep it in their pockets or whatever, I don't know. But this is the only piece of gold work that I've seen, you know, incorporated. And then my last slide is just, you know, I stopped telling this story about 1920, but, you know, Alaskan Native art is ongoing. It's just, it's thrived in response or stimulated significantly by the two big Smithsonian exhibitions, Inua in 1988 and Crossroads shortly thereafter, which I think just reconnected a lot of people with aspects of their culture and heritage. And so it's still a vibe. I just want to end it, you know, we're not frozen in time, that, you know, ivory working and relationships that people have with animals, walrus actually, continue to this day. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Okay, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Please feel free to stand up and stretch if you need to. And thank you so much to all of you who are here and who are online for sitting through this really great symposium. I really appreciate Stephen's last slide because it transitions really well, I think, into what I'd like to speak about today. My name is Emily Jean Leischner, and I'm really happy to be here on the territory of the Wampanoag and the Pokanoket. And I'm really happy to be invited by Naomi and staff at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And as the title of my slide suggests, I'm going to kind of move us in this last talk of the symposium today out of the past and sort of into thinking about present, the meanings of museum collections for present and future generations, both for museum staff, researchers, as well as Indigenous communities. But I want to start by just briefly introducing myself. I am a non-Indigenous community-based researcher, a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver in Canada, on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I've been working in and with museums and archives for over a decade now, and my research partners with colleagues and cultural organizations in a First Nation on the central coast of British Columbia to study and collaborate with institutions that hold their heritage. My interest in studying museums and in using community-based methods to do so is both a personal and a scholarly one. I'm the descendant of multiple generations of settlers, of immigrants with a mix of European backgrounds, Irish, British, French, Dutch, probably others, all of whom arrived in North America nearly 400 years ago. My ancestors were largely frontier farmers, advancing and acquiring land in the United States as it was forcibly and violently taken from Indigenous nations. I didn't actually learn about this history until my mid-20s when I was using genealogical websites to sort of track the origins of my ancestors and their movement across the continent. At the same time as I was coming to terms with how my relatives had benefited from the theft of Indigenous land, I was also volunteering for a repatriation department in a museum in Philadelphia. I was conducting archival research on the network of contacts who trafficked in human remains across the continent. It was sort of the goal of reuniting ancestors back with their living descendants. So both personally and professionally, I was really drawn towards this reckoning with these legacies of colonialism. And this resonance between my own family history and the unethical realities of heritage collections continues to be something that I can't turn away from. So broadly, my research is action-oriented and community-focused. I care about doing work that strengthens community members' access and control over their own heritage and histories, especially working with those whose heritage has been appropriated, stolen, erased, or misrepresented. Through my research, I seek to identify the ongoing legacies of harm and injustice that are present in collecting, stewarding, and representing material culture. And then by partnering with and learning from my collaborators, I hope to better understand the limits and possibilities of using the power and knowledge of heritage institutions to challenge these structures of oppression, of colonialism, and to advocate for racial and social justice. Okay. Today, my primary research and ethical commitments are centered with the New Hulk First Nation, whose territory is located here in the northwest coast of British Columbia. Working in reciprocity with New Hulk colleagues since 2016, I study the historical and contemporary appropriation of New Hulk knowledge and heritage. My research is led by New Hulk partners, scholars, and friends, and is committed to upholding New Hulk sovereignty. Together, we collaborate on diverse creative projects that strengthen the nation's access and control over their own heritage, while fostering connections between the nation and cultural institutions worldwide. I also want to mention that although I am the one speaking here today, all knowledge is sort of created in conversation and in community. And so there are a great number of people who this work depends on who are not able to speak with me today. Those include my friends Sinhakila Clyde Talio, Nunanda Iris Saiwalis, Sycamus Jacob Gascoigne, Nicole Cakeley, who are all part of the New Hulk Ancestral Governance Office. And I'll mention a few more of my community collaborators further on in this talk. The New Hulk Nation has a really long history of engagement with museums. Notably, when 9 New Hulk men traveled to Germany on a tour from 1885 to 1886, they met and inspired the so-called future father of American anthropology, Franz Boas, to alter the entire trajectory of his career to focus on the Northwest Coast. Today, the nation has a robust network of cultural experts and heritage organizations that continue to utilize and collaborate with the institutions that hold their tangible and intangible cultural knowledge. I also want to clarify that although this work is deeply informed by the insights and perspectives that New Hulk people have shared with me, the nation itself has never been my focus of study. Instead, I conduct research on collecting institutions like museums and archives alongside New Hulk scholars, learning and imagining together how museum work might be done otherwise. And here's a picture of New Hulk ancestral territory, so you get an idea of what we're talking about. As we've learned today, the whaling industry in the Pacific Northwest transported more than its intended cargo. Ships crisscrossing the Pacific Ocean were responsible for the early distribution of Indigenous heritage across the globe, jumpstarting what Tsimshian anthropologist Robin Gray calls the, quote, hyper-dispossession of Indigenous land, art, culture, and knowledge. Regardless of how they were acquired, ethically or not, the present-day reality for many Indigenous communities is the same. Historical Indigenous heritage is overwhelmingly not in the communities that it came from. Heldsick archival scholar Kimberly Lawson calls the belongings held in museums and archives, quote, precious fragments, to communicate the value that this knowledge has to living communities today. And this museum is no exception. Over its long history of preserving and caring for the history of the whaling industry in this region, the museum has acquired collections that are of great personal and cultural value to Indigenous nations across the world. And we've been fortunate enough today to hear from so many scholars who have explained and shown some of these objects to us. In speaking with staff here at the museum, and even more so after attending this fantastic symposium, it's clear that there's a strong desire to address the colonial legacies within museums and to reconnect Indigenous belongings back to their communities of origin. So in this presentation, I want to share some brief examples of my research, which involves doing just that. First, I want to talk about how I go about doing community engaged research with museums. And then I want to share an example of this type of work and what it looks like from my time partnering and collaborating with members of the Newhook First Nation. So what I've developed through my research and time working with the nation is a strategy for community engagement that I've come to call community-based heritage research. So rather than studying the Newhook community, we study the institutions that hold Newhook heritage, with the ultimate goal of benefiting the nation itself. To do this, we partnered together on creative and activist projects focused on Newhook sovereignty. This way of doing research together is inspired by other collaborative and community-based academic research methods, particularly in the fields of archaeology, Indigenous, and decolonizing studies. Drawing on a broad legacy from decolonial, women's, civil rights, labor, queer, and Indigenous rights movements, our practices share a desire to disrupt the power traditionally held by researchers. Working with a network of community and university scholars, we try to take proactive steps to community identified needs. Our work draws on a flexible set of principles, including reciprocity, accountability, shared decision-making, social justice, trust, and reflexivity. Community-based heritage research centers the goals of these collaborations outside of exhibition halls and museum controls initiatives, meeting communities where their strengths, priorities, and needs are. So in Newhook territory, my colleagues and I have been conducting this type of research on museums and archives that hold Newhook heritage for years. In partnership with scholars like Dr. Jennifer Kramer, who's a curator at the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver, Newhook people have traveled in person to visit collections, sharing the knowledge that the nation has about these treasures, which is, I'll add, a huge benefit to the institutions that steward them, and taking photographs and information back home to the nation. So when I first started working with the nation in their ancestral governance office, I was able to see the benefits of these visits firsthand in a coming of age ceremony where Newhook cedar bark weavers recreated a woven cloak and hat based on pictures from the National Museum of the American Indian. So today our research team, which you can see pictured here, includes myself, Dr. Kramer, and the Itnuhakma Language and Culture Authority, who are Sinhikula Clyde Talio, Nunanda Iris Saiwalis, Kwak Spencer Saiwalis, and Skiwikta Karen Anderson. And we're working together to imagine what a future Newhook museum, nation-owned and controlled in the territory, might look like. Okay, one more slide. There we go. Finally, I want to briefly share with you an example of community-based heritage research from my dissertation, which is almost finished, which is called Captured Audio, Resource Extraction and the Collection, Stewardship, and Return of Newhook Voices in Museums and Archives. So with a local community radio station, Newhook Radio 91.1 FM, I co-created a collaborative radio show on the history of museum collecting in their territory called Using and Refusing Museums. Co-hosted by myself and Newhook artist and producer Nanutsakis Kyle Mactalio, Season 1 was a joint production created to answer a community-driven question. How did objects, what many Newhook people call treasures, end up in museums? In this first season of 8 episodes, each about an hour long, we sought to answer this question together through interviews with artists and community members, sharing stories and research about individual collectors and broader Northwest Coast collecting histories, and responding to feedback from the community. Rather than prioritizing the value of museums or the biographies of collectors, we aim to center the lives and authority and experiences of New Hope people themselves. We wanted to reciprocally share and interpret knowledge with the community and provide an opportunity to examine the impact of past museum collecting on the nation. While allowing for space for discussing the very nuanced legacies of collectors, the program also celebrated the work that New Hope people are already doing to care for themselves and for those yet to come. In a New Hope context, this theory of working for the betterment of future generations is often referred to as thinking of the putelt, those not yet born. Or as we asked on using and refusing museums, how did our ancestors and how do we make good the path for future generations? Season 2 also responded to a community-driven question. How can repatriation be done in a New Hope way? And what should happen to New Hope heritage when it is returned to the nation? We collaboratively worked to answer these questions live on air, through interviews with other First Nations community members and sharing stories about repatriation in New Hope territory and beyond. Fittingly, just a month ago, the nation welcomed back home the Sinheltwa pole, which was repatriated from the Royal British Columbia Museum, the RBCM in Victoria, BC, after over 100 years away. The journey has not been an easy one. This pole was stolen from a grave site, one of many treasures left behind when the smallpox epidemic drove New Hope people out of many of their traditional village sites in the 1860s. It was eventually sold to the RBCM, and New Hope leaders working on the repatriation sought formal approval from hereditary leadership to do this work, and also pursued a lawsuit against the museum when negotiations stalled. Over a century later, and nearly 100 members of the nations traveled to the museum to escort the pole home, where it will be welcomed back and celebrated before eventually returning to the earth. We hope to conclude season 2 of Using and Refusing Museums by reflecting on what this return means for the nation today. Following the broadcast of this first season, the founder of New Hope Radio, filmmaker and station manager, Sultlani Banshi Hanous, asked me to identify, locate, and return copies of sound recordings of New Hope voices, starting with the British Columbia Archives in Victoria and the Canadian Museum of History in Quebec. In doing this, my colleagues and I noticed how New Hope voices, historically and in the present, have been treated as a resource, often taken, decontextualized, and used without their permission. Under both US and Canadian laws, the person who presses the record button is considered the owner of sound recordings, not the person whose voice is actually recorded. I know. My dissertation tracks what happens to recordings of New Hope voices as they circulate in archives and museums outside of the nation's control and authority, and investigates how to go about disrupting this logic of Indigenous voice as resource. Returning New Hope recordings to the nation has been hugely beneficial to language revitalization and reawakening ancestral laws and protocols. Today, many of these recordings are played on the radio. In the future, they'll be cataloged in a digital library and audio dictionary with the goal of providing a centralized online space for New Hope people to access New Hope language and historical materials in digital formats, including sound recordings, photographs, and text. In the future, I hope to continue working with Ancestral Governance Office to better understand how we might use New Hope laws to protect New Hope voices in archives and museums. So, as I hope this talk has shown, engaging with Indigenous communities brings really incredible benefits to Indigenous nations, to museums, and to the public. Community-based heritage research cannot absolve museums or myself of the ways that we've benefited from stolen land and stolen heritage. That's not the goal. However, by insisting that communities are the primary benefactors and experts in collaborative research, I believe that researching heritage institutions in this way can do some good, not only for Indigenous communities, but also for the people and places around the globe that hold Indigenous heritage in their collections. In the future, I hope to continue to do this work with and for museums and cultural institutions and staff that will hopefully leave good legacies for future generations. Thanks so much. Melanie has the
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for like that enjoyable panel. I have a bunch of questions. Hopefully they won't be too long, but my first one, I just want to make sure I start using the right language. So from what I understand from today, Scrimshaw is basically a whaler's art. And if it's not Scrimshaw, should I use indigenous ivories like for the totem that we saw today or some of the other pieces that you guys displayed? Because I think part of the problem is if people don't know what to call it, they call it the wrong name.
That was my personal push. I don't know whether this museum would accept it, whether the exhibit would accept it. It's just the difference in terminology. As I said, we never call ivory scrimshaw in anthropology department. So that's the reality. Stephen.
I would say I've had the experience that when I talk about these artworks, audience participants often ask, "Oh, isn't that Scrimshaw?" And it's like it's never been a word that because I think when I think Scrimshaw, I think like very specifically like of the first panel of this morning. Like this is like it's not only a United States Yankee. I don't know. I grew up in Texas, so it's weird to think about Yankee as a descriptor. Yeah, exactly. But I think maybe in what you're speaking about this morning, about the diversity of objects, I think that's an unresolved question. And what is so exciting about the project is that it's not using Scrimshaw as the category to define all of them, but as an entry point into sort of understanding how incredibly diverse, especially these practices that are actually very common, like incision and carving. Actually, I think a lot of the practices are incised practices. Maybe there's also a commonality of making and of modeling that I think is really common across the objects. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of just my point of view.
No, it does help. And I have one question for you, Bart, which is how many of the reindeer survived?
That's a good question. Only I think 100 of them actually got to Alaska proper because there were so many delays in the '98 movement for various reasons that they just ran out of lichen. And that's really kind of the only so there are photographs of the reindeer when they're in Seattle and they're all just like emaciated. And then that's still before they went to San Francisco and up.
I just want to add that they kept importing reindeer from Siberia as well, not the reindeer herders, like what they did with the Saami and the Chukchi for the first year. That didn't work. But when they brought Saami in, and there was like this nestion kind of reindeer herding operation, they kept bringing reindeer from Siberia because it was so much easier. But there's still, photographs of them being transported, by hooks from the ships to the shore. Quite traumatic for the animals, but nonetheless far less traumatic than going from Norway to Alaska.
That's a crazy story. I have one more quick question. Okay. So I had a list. So why cribbage boards? I mean, why was that something that they manufactured and commercialized?
That's a great question. I mean, so like the cribbage board as an object is already like a Scrimshaw object that whalers are also making. Like there are already like white people on these boats making cribbage boards. So that already exists as a form before they ever reach like a Yupik or Yupik homelands. I recall reading somewhere that playing cards were also very popular among Inupiaq and Yupik in trading. So I think there's also just like they just became interested in what these objects are. And then also a funny aside is that when Sami arrived in person, Some Inupiaq said, oh, these are the people from the trading cards, because they have, Sami have very elaborate gakti, ceremonial regalia that they wear, and they have, this four-pointed hat. So they thought, there's this funny record that they thought it was the people who it was predestined that the Sami would arrive because they looked like the people from the playing cards in their costume. But I think so. It's this kind of an adaptation of already using walrus tusk into this imported sort of board game. But I mean, it's weird because it's also a board game, and it seems weird to think of people actually using them as game boards because they're kind of established as this art historical thing. So it's a good question. It is weird that it proliferates so much.
Okay, so we have some questions from our Zoom audience. So this one is from Ingrid. Emily, will you or someone else upload the Nuxall voices to an Indigenous database system such as Merkutu in the future?
That is a great question. I'll just say that the decision of whether or not to do that is not necessarily mine. It'll rest with the nation itself and New Hulk Radio. At this time, there isn't a plan to do that. Really, the focus has been making sure that members of the nation have access to hearing the voices of their relatives and ancestors first and foremost. But that's a really great question. And Merkutu is a really, for anyone who doesn't know, is a really excellent database that many Native American and First Nations use to organize and manage their own cultural heritage. So the nation I work with is not using it, but many do. Thanks.
So our second question is from Bob Wallace, and it is also for Emily. Has the creation and practice of the Maka Museum and Research Center in Nebe influenced your own research goals or practice?
Yeah, that's another really great question. I'm fortunate enough to be working on the Northwest Coast, in which there are a huge number of cultural institutions that are owned and operated by First Nations communities. And I know that that's also true here in the US. Yes, is kind of a short answer. The Language and Culture Authority that I work with has the people on it have much more robust relationships and connections with First Nations up and down the coast and so we're definitely thinking about and learning from all of these other examples of how museums and cultural institutions can be used to benefit their own communities, and who is the audience, whether it's an outsider, a tourist audience for bringing in revenue, or whether it's focusing on members of the nation, or whether you're trying to do both. A lot of complicated questions there. But yeah, we're really lucky to be working in a space in which there's a lot of people to learn from. Thanks for the question.
So I just wanted to pick up briefly on the cribbage question, because I think we sort of underestimate the popularity of cribbage as a card game that requires counters among sailors, both in the 19th century and I think continuing today. Certainly, anecdotally, some of my tall ship sailor friends all still play cribbage with each other. And I don't know of any of them using ivory cribbage boards, but certainly in the past, there was a market for it that's driven in part by the popularity of that particular game. I also, would love to hear a little bit more if people have thoughts on this, Scrimshaw and Ivory's kind of thing, where, I think in our collection, we've looked at a lot of Bering Sea people's ivory carving through the lens of starting with Yankee Scrimshaw and seeing the influence when the whalers arrive, and there's an influence, and then there's a market-driven change. And so it's easy to see calling that Scrimshaw because you see the influence of these people coming in and affecting an existing tradition. But I think I'm certainly going to come away today with maybe that isn't the right term anymore, and that although there's that influence from the Yankee whalers coming in, that doesn't need to be our definition point for what the carvings in that area actually mean. So no question there, just a couple of comments springing from what people have said.
I would that I think when we think about the change in, the visual language, it goes from this customary, very old and, and that we have from very, this very ancient period onwards, and that it changes visually, I think that doesn't mean that just because the forms are modeled or depicted in a different way that their meanings disappear for the communities who make them, right? I think there's still a way that they still remain just as indigenous in what they're doing and what they're expressing, and in ways that I think also like maybe exceed, right? But yes, okay, it's one thing to depict a fish, you depict native animals, that's what the tourist wants to see, but there's also already a different relationship. I think that's still visible. And the same kind of relational qualities that we heard our other speakers on our panel talking about, they don't just disappear just because the style looks different. So I think that's an important thing that I would, I guess, suggest to keep in mind too.
I would add to this that there may be several words in between. So there is one already used today, which is hybrid arts. There is the word that hasn't been used today, which is tourist or souvenir art. And to me, at least under my perspective, so if this museum agrees, Scrimshaw is like a typical whaler's style, and the ivory, or whatever we call it, decorated ivory, is a typical native style. There's a huge space in between, particularly after the contact. And so what they were selling in Nome was not hybrid art, it was tourist art. It was souvenir art, primarily. Maybe it's not that much a distinction I'm not an art historian, so I cannot make the definition, but I can make a definition by the situation in which the art was produced and exchanged or traded. So the hybrid art is not a word for something that doesn't have any connotation, but the souvenir art or a tourist art has a very strong connotation for what it is produced, how it is exchanged, and what both sides anticipate from this interaction. So I think we have to figure out the interactive moment that probably for this exhibit of yours is very important, because the wider world and Scrimshaw goes through all these arts in between. That's kind of my take on this.
Okay, this question actually continues on that same conversation about the Bering Strait ivories. I was wondering, a lot of your talks highlighted sort of the stylistic change and iconographic change from the sort of customary art to this, post, touristic moment or moment of exchange and broader circulation. And I was wondering if any of those shifts that you see, in the imagery and as well as stylistically, also reflect any kind of epistemological change in what those images signify. Like Bart, your example seemed to show like a lot of those later works were like narratives of some kind. And so I don't know if that's a change from a customary form or whether those images functioned in the same way in terms of meaning as well as in terms of style.
I'll start, and I hope my colleague and friend Stephen Loring will continue, because we deliberately both skipped the 2,000-year history of different art styles in indigenous ivories in the Bering Strait region. And this is very well stratified culturally by specific styles or cultures that the archaeologists have been using for the past almost 100 years to define different historical, let's say, cultures and artistic traditions. Old Bering Sea, Okvik, Thule. Stephen mentioned Thule, but I didn't mention any of these. What it means is that we have a very good knowledge, or pretty good knowledge, of how one artistic style of this ancient cultural or artistic tradition changed into another one. What were the elements, how it transformed, how you define the difference between the Okvik, let's say, and the Punuk or the Birnirk kind of culture style. We can immediately identify which one is this and probably give a date based on the decoration style. Now, the Scrimshaw, as we learned today, is 300 years old, and the Scrimshaw interaction with indigenous ivories is probably 150 years old. So this is something that I did some search before coming here, what has been written on commercial development of indigenous ivories in the Bering Strait, commercial development. So found one article. Doesn't mean that there is just one, but it's not that there are so many. So the whole idea of how indigenous art developed and changed under the influence of commercial, not artistic, but commercial impact, selection by buyers, selection by traders, selection by mediators, museums. That's all kind of under research and under developed and under published. And maybe your exhibit will make this important step in this direction. But so far, there is no definitive answer, Stephen.
Yeah. I think that, I think kind of pre-lead or pre-period, there's in our talk initially, there's this, this solidly grounded indigenous perspective relationship clearly to kind of the spiritual dimension of relationship to animals that's depicted in the day-to-day tool and some kind of Scrimshaw-ish imagery on some of the objects. And then you have the whole vaudeville industry, which is depicting domestic scenes, depicting, it's like the newspaper today, and the mic's not working. It's depicting, they're like the newspaper of the day. It's sort of like depicting, issues and events, and some of them are seasonal tallies. You get, like the whalers, and they have their log books, with the whaling stamp. Some of these boat drills just have, little steel flippers or, box heads or something indicating, how many animals were taken. But all that changes very dramatically with the emergence of this kind of tourist souvenir art around 1900, and that imagery that is deeply personal and deeply spiritual I think is transformed to sort of like, what do people want? They want to see us hunting walrus. They want to see us, hunting caribou. It loses that intimacy, with the past or with, indigenous cultural traditions as something and then let's make cribbage boards, because one guy was selling all his cribbage boards. The other guy that didn't, make little drill holes wasn't selling as much. So it is a transformative period, I think. So not sure if that answers your question, but that's sort of.
Okay.
I want to add again, if I may take like 3 more minutes, on what Stephen said, is that the tourist art, that's the same transition of of a real totem pole into a model totem pole that you give to tourists. You still have some connection, but that's a very different connection that you have with your real totem. So that line probably can be used most productively in understanding the difference between the transition from Aboriginal art with all its, remarkable symbolic meaning, with all its remarkable language, with kind of dualism transition from, one spiritual status to another one, different shapes. A lot has been written about it. And then you go into something that you do for the tourists who do not understand this language. Absolutely not. Look for exoticism in your art style. You still try to put something, often intuitively, often deliberately, that is from your own culture, but you know that your buyer cannot read your language. Your buyer cannot understand your message. So as devoted as you could be in trying to preserve your culture, and remember that's like late 1800s, early 1900s, you're doing it for sale, you still do not have this kind of the whole ideology of ethnic revival through arts. That is a very modern kind of development. So then you naturally trying to do like, I don't want to use this word, but all these kitschy elements kind of crawl into your art style because it fits what your buyer wants from you. Exoticism, your buyer coming to Alaska on a boat from Seattle and back wants to bring something to his or her relatives. Look, I was in the north, I was in Alaska, so here was something out of walrus ivory, and it shows a dog, or it shows a walrus, or it shows an Eskimo. Whereas all spiritual meaning, it's lost. So maybe that element can be also used into the understanding of how these artistic traditions progressed and how they then went upward back in today's indigenous carving and ivory, where people are trying to recreate that spiritual connection that many have never lost, but they have probably weakened the language, the symbolism, and now it's coming back also as a souvenir art. So it's a very long and complicated trajectory, which is barely 170 years of age, from 1850 to, let's say, 2020 some. And one of the books that I'm leaving here with the museum is exactly about how this traditional ivory carving style and language is now being revitalized by indigenous carvers in Nome, who understand very clearly that they have to preserve and develop their culture in that very traditional style.
Hi, I just I wanted to say thank you, and also I wanted to kind of recenter us back to a couple of things. One is in regards to what words to use. I recall visiting a collection in Alaska, which is part of my practice, is kind of diving deeper into museums. And when I was looking at the labels, every label was in English except for one label that said Usik. And I said, what's an Usik? And an Usik, does anybody want to fill in?
It's a penis bone.
Yeah, it's a penis bone from a walrus. And I said, why is it that the word? And they said, well, there's no other way to really say it than to say it from the language of the people, which is Usik. And so I guess I'm offering an opportunity for people to further engage the language of which these pieces are coming from, which then can help to offset the displacement of concerns of whether something has cultural or spiritual connection versus other connections. I think about that as being somebody who's hubbed under indigeneity, where there is no one thing in regards to that. I'm Shinnecock, and the people that I am traveling to are from their own respective nations and communities, And then in and of that self, they are singular people from those communities. So when I think about the idea of tourism and trade and feeding an economy, I would ask people to go a little bit further than that to understand how is it that a community who understands relationship to place is then positioned to pull in a different type of economy to feed their family and themselves. That has to do with colonial impact and offset and components of war forced upon these communities to then have to sell in a different way and potentially shift that relationship. I would also offer that these are collections we're talking about. How did these pieces get there? And also that those pieces, some of the, there was an image in one of the pieces in the back was a shaman whale box. I can't, it was the pie piece that was highlighted, but in the back I could see things that, you know, when you take away somebody's church, where do they go to pray? So I think that there's a continual component to collecting, to offset, to displacement, that is a further addition to the answers that were being offered and the conversations that are being offered here today. But there is no such thing as Indigenous or Native American. We are from our respective communities with our own languages and relationships to place. So within that wider world in Scrimshaw, there is that opportunity to have an usik or to have other words when those are there, and also have that be determined by the people. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that reminder of community and specificity in place as we wrap up for today. So I'd like to, we're past our mark here. I think we need to send you all on your way with great appreciation for you joining us here at the museum and on Zoom. Incredibly grateful to the team, the museum team here who's been staffing the space and our technology, and to our incredible speakers who've offered so much of their time to us today. So thank you to everyone for coming, and hopefully this has just inspired future conversation and work around these areas. So thank you, everyone.